Good morning, everyone, and welcome back as we continue the Governor's Opioid Response Webinar series. My name is Josh Miller, and I am the Opioid Response Project Manager out of the Office of Behavioral Health. We have a great presentation today, which will focus on the intersection of brain injuries and substance use disorder. Presenting will be Dr. Carolyn Lemsky with Community Head Injury Resource Services, and Steve Wade, who will be moderating, and he's with the Brain Injury Association of America. I'd like to remind everyone to please use the Q&A section to ask questions. We always try our best to answer all questions during this 1 hour time frame. However, that's not always possible. We'll make sure to respond to your questions that don't get answered after this webinar and update them on the AdCare Summit webpage. We won't have a webinar next month. Instead, we will have a live event. I know, that's very exciting. The title is An Evening with journalist and author Sam Quinones, a lively and active discussion on opioid policy in Maine and across the country. Please join us on this special evening where Governor Janet Mills will interview acclaimed author and journalist Sam Quinones. Following this interview, there will be a panel discussion. Additionally, Points North Institute will continue its series, Recovery in Maine. We will show the documentaries of Recovery in Washington County, along with Recovery in Androscoggin County. This event will take place on the University of Southern Maine campus at the Abersom Center on Wednesday, April 6th, from 6:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. I will now introduce Steve Wade. Steve is the Consulting Executive Director of the Brain Injury Association of America for the Maine chapter. He also is the Executive Director of the Brain Injury Association of New Hampshire. Mr. Wade has 30 years experience in organizational development and team building for the brain injury communities throughout New England. He received the National Leadership Award for the Brain Injury Association Professional of the Year by his peers. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Steve.
Well, thank you very much, Josh, and welcome everyone. On behalf of the Brain Injury Association of America Maine chapter, I wanted to thank Josh and his team, the Opioid Response Program, AdCare, for the opportunity to present this webinar on the intersection of brain injury and substance use and overdose. There's some really exciting efforts currently going on in the state to raise awareness of this issue and trying to build the capacity of community-based organizations to support folks who are struggling with brain injury as a result of substance use and overdose. And it's a really nice partnership. It's between the Office of Aging and Disability Services, the Brain and Spinal Cord Injury, the Acquired Brain Injury Advisory Council for Maine, as well as the Brain Injury Association of America Maine chapter. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carolyn Lemsky. Dr. Lemsky is a board-certified neuropsychologist with over 25 years experience working in rehabilitation settings in the US and Canada. She is the clinical director at the Community Head Injury Resource Center of Toronto, which is a Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care funded agency designed to promote community reintegration of persons living with acquired brain injuries. For the past 15 years, she's been the director of the Substance Use and Brain Injury Bridging Project, and a research and knowledge transfer initiative funded by the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation. Along with her partners at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, she has provided over 70 workshops and webinars for addictions and brain injury providers across the US and Canada. One of their key products has been a brain injury toolkit, which was funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration Technology Transfer Centers. In addition to frequent conference presentations, Dr. Lemsky has contributed book chapters and articles to the neuropsychology and brain injury literature, and she is currently the adjunct professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. So Dr. Lemsky, welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you. I guess one of the things that I'll say in terms of how I come to this is I am a clinical neuropsychologist. I've been working in tertiary medical centers, working with people who were living with the effects of acquired brain injury. And when I moved up to Canada, I started to work with folks in the community. And I kind of came into addictions kicking and screaming. I really didn't have any awareness that, actually it's 30 years ago now, of the intimate connection between substance use and brain injury. So this is a topic that has become near and dear to my heart, mostly because my clinical work has shown me how essential it is to understand what this intersection is. So it's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about some of what we have learned about substance use and acquired brain injury. I know from looking online that Maine has been hit hard, very much the same way that Ontario has. And I also know that Maine has mounted a very robust response for prevention and intervention. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the fact that a lot of fatal overdoses have been avoided because of those efforts. And what I was able to lift off of line were some data from May 2021. And I'm just going to kind of use this as an example, doing a little bit of a deeper dive into those data. We see that unfortunately, there were 48 fatal overdoses in Maine in May 2021. But that was kind of the tip of the iceberg because there were 571 non-fatal overdoses in that same month. 313 of those were seen in emergency rooms, 157 were attended by EMTs, and there were at least 101 community reversals. And if you, like me, work in the community with folks who have significant difficulties with opioid use, you know that that 101 number may just be the tip of the iceberg because so many reversed overdoses don't get reported officially. So what that means, in May 2021, just as an example, for every fatal overdose in Maine, there were 13 non-fatal overdoses. Now, what we know from multi-site studies and this college et al. Reference is actually a meta-analysis looking at the combined results from a number of studies, both in North America and Europe. We know that about 20% of people who use opioids are at risk for an episode of overdose every year. And each non-fatal overdose comes with a new risk of neurocognitive impairment. What we also know is that a history of traumatic brain injury, and this is something that a part of the story that will kind of be woven in as we go, increases the risk of fatal overdose by about threefold. And it's not just a one-way causal relationship. So for today, we only have an hour together. I'm going to try and just use the hour to increase awareness of the intersection between overdose-related cognitive impairment and other acquired brain injuries and their potential impact on service delivery. We're going to talk a little bit about, in a very sort of high-level way, big overview, the effects of hypoxia and anoxia associated with opioid use and overdose. And what I'm hoping to do is provide, and this will probably be a really quick, again, high-level overview of the essential skills that are required to address neurocognitive impairments in the people that you're serving. We know that you're working at this in a variety of different settings with very different resources, very different kinds of personnel. There may be some physicians who are watching, who are working in medical clinics designed to work with people who have opioid use disorders, methadone clinics. And then there may be some community-based programs and even programs serving people who are homeless and marginally housed. So the recommendations that I'm going to be talking about today are pretty high level, related to screening and cognitive impairment, screening for brain injury and cognitive impairment, recognizing and compensating for functional impairments, and then program and case management considerations that might be necessary. The most important thing I'll probably say today, the most important thing I think that's going to happen is hopefully I'll be giving you enough information that you're going to think about what you want to do to maybe adjust the services that you're providing in your setting. And so probably the most important thing I'll be doing is introducing some free and available training resources so that you, in whatever way you think is appropriate, you can pursue making changes or additions to your programming. So getting started, let's think about the brain and oxygen use. Your brain makes up only about 2% of your body weight, but it uses about 20% of the oxygen, about 15% of the blood pumped by your heart. So that's kind of an energy hog relative to other organs in the system. So what are the impacts of respiratory suppression? Well, we're going to see a little bit of a demonstration of that, but hypoxia, which is the term that's used to look at, to talk about a reduction in oxygen available to the brain. So that's when that oxygen saturation number kind of goes down and there's less available blood oxygen circulating through the body and thus available to the brain. And that can cause temporary memory loss, reduced coordination, inattentiveness, and poor judgment. And when there's an absence of oxygen or anoxia, it can result in coma, seizure, and brain death. I just, because I think it's fascinating, we're going to start out with a little, and hopefully I'll make the technology work here properly, a video demonstration.
And to find out why, I'm going to put myself through the same experience. These are the laboratories of Kinetic in Hampshire, operated by Dr. Henry Looper and his team. The room I'm sitting in is a decompression chamber. Any second now, all the air is going to be sucked out of it, leaving me at an equivalent altitude of 25,000 feet. All military pilots have to do this training, so they become familiar with the effects of sudden hypoxia.
Okay, just confirm you're happy to proceed.
Yeah, very happy.
Stand by for rapid decompression. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
As the pressure drops, the chamber suddenly fogs up as the moisture condenses out of the air.
It's a lot colder in here now. Some condensation in the cabin.
25,000 feet.
While I've still got my breathing mask on, I can function fine at this altitude.
So still on oxygen at this point, and the oxygen saturation probe there is showing me 99% saturated.
Okay, you're feeling all well?
Feeling good.
But when the time comes to take my mask off, I'll be suddenly exposed to air with only a third of the amount of oxygen in it.
What I would like you to do is drop your mask and then switch the regulator off.
This is rapid decompression. Unlike in the mountains, there's no time to acclimatize to the lack of oxygen. And the effects are very different. Whilst initially I can easily perform normal functions like writing my name and address, my blood oxygen levels are falling dramatically.
Quite alarming, that drop in oxygen saturation went straight down. We're still going down.
How are you feeling? Because you're already looking slightly pale in the face now.
Yeah, I'm feeling tingling in my hands at the moment. A little bit lightheaded.
And within a couple of minutes, I'm struggling to perform even simple tasks.
So you've got 4 blocks here. What I'd like you to do is try and make these blocks match the silhouette that you see on the card there.
Right.
But although I was struggling to perform these tasks, I really didn't care. The overriding sensation I was feeling was one of euphoria and well-being. But after 3 minutes, I can't even write properly. I'm now in great danger and not even registering anything that's said to me.
Then we need to take some corrective actions now. What I'd like you to do is lift the mask up to your face, Kevin. Lift the mask up to your face. Lift the mask up to your face, Kevin. And I will do that for you. What I need you to do now is just take long, slow, gentle breaths.
So what you can see in that example is a pretty good overview of the effects that you might see as the result of a loss of oxygen to the brain. And what's really kind of remarkable here is that it's a silent hypoxia. He's not struggling for breath. He's not aware of the fact that there's less oxygen getting to the brain, and that he's aware perhaps that he's having difficulties, but there's an overall sense of euphoria. And what this gives you is kind of a little bit of a sense for how difficult it is to be aware of the cognitive changes and to be sufficiently concerned about the cognitive changes that might be occurring in order to make adjustments for them, which really kind of highlights the need for clinicians to be aware of the potential impacts of hypoxia and anoxia and be actively screening for those. So what's actually happening here is that there's damage to vulnerable structures. And some of the structures that are most vulnerable are the ones that are the biggest energy hogs in the brain, the ones that use the most glucose and the most oxygen to do their work. One of those structures is the hippocampus. It's a memory structure that's deep in the temporal lobes. And the job of the hippocampus essentially is to make the connections between sensory and cognitive inputs so that we have the experience of having a coherent memory. So it's sort of an indexing system, if you will, that allows us to pull together information in the form of a memory. We know that the basal ganglia and the globus pallidus are also really structures that are really vulnerable to damage. And basically they run through the middle of the brain. They're sort of densely packed with neuronal tracts. And what they are essentially is a switching station for sensory information and coordination. So that's what enables your brain to be able to take information, organize it, and then act on it using all of the different functions of the brain together. And we know that changes in white matter often occur. There's a leukoencephalopathy or white matter disease that shows up on imaging, for example, in chronic opioid or heroin use. And that's also related to hypoxia or anaxia in the long run. There might be an immediate change in white matter visible, but then there are also delayed or long-term kinds of problems that changes that can happen in the weeks to months following an anoxic or hypoxic episode, where further deterioration in the abilities of the brain to sort of communicate one structure to the other. And that's in large part what the white matter is responsible for, is connecting all of those areas of the brain so that it can function in a coordinated fashion. So we know that with hypoxia and anoxia, there are changes to these vital structures related to memory and overall coordination of brain functions, and also motor functions. The cerebellum at the back of the brain is also a heavy user of oxygen and glucose, and it also can be affected, creating problems with movement. And when there's an absence of oxygen to support the functions of the brain, seizures and death. Those changes can occur between 3 to 6 minutes. And as we'll talk about, it's not just the absence of oxygen that's at play in many of the clients that we're serving. So what are the cognitive and behavioral things that you're going to see? Memory loss, slowing, so that difficulty coordinating all of the brain functions together, so difficulty processing information, which results in impaired judgment. And sometimes it's subtle, just devaluing the need to delay gratification and being very, very impulsive and keyed into immediate gratification. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that happens. Changes in mood and personality that might be observed as irritability or depression, in some cases kind of confusion or a lack of focus. We know that visuospatial functioning often deteriorates, so a person will have more difficulty with the kinds of tasks that you saw in the video, doing constructions or finding your way around complex environments. And planning and problem solving can also be affected in very much the same way as you saw in that video. some of the impacts, if the hypoxic episode was relatively brief and relatively recent, might be fairly subtle. And the individual may not even be aware that they're happening. They're still able to talk, they're still able to communicate, but as you saw, maybe less able to understand the need to register and complete a command, and just may demonstrate generally poor judgment. And then on the polar extreme, if a person's been hospitalized and in coma for a long period of time, the cognitive impairments may be very significant and very severe. We also see sensory motor impairments that may be subtle, like, you know, a little trouble writing or a little trouble with manual dexterity, or they may be more obvious and result in a longer term change in the way a person walks, or ataxia, the same kinds of motor impairments that you might see with intoxication. We know that people sometimes have vision changes, that it might include blurriness. Sometimes blindness can result depending on how severe the anoxia was and whether it affected the cranial nerves associated with vision, or the visual cortex. And reduced hearing for the same reason, whether it's the auditory nerve that's affected or some of the cortical structures that interpret auditory information, and then just slower processing. This is, if you're interested in doing a deep dive, there's a recent review out that has kind of an exhaustive review of the papers that have looked at the actual neurocognitive impairments of that are resulted from overdose. But one, I think the most interesting findings that they have is that you can't look at just the overdoses. You have to look at all the other things that are potentially having an impact on this person, including the neurotoxic impacts of the opioids themselves and other drugs that may be used by that individual, and how those drugs affect memory and executive functioning. And we also know that this is a group that may, because of their substance use habits, put themselves at risk for different kinds of chronic infections, including HIV and hepatitis, and as we'll talk about a little later, perhaps encephalitis or brain abscesses. And so those are other potential sources of neurocognitive impairment. And then, as I alluded to before, there's that risk of traumatic brain injury that seems to be elevated in this group, whether it's because of their previous history of brain injury, or because their intoxication has made them more susceptible to sustaining new injuries. And then there's the possible additive effect of these multiple overdoses. We know that one overdose puts you at risk for future overdoses. Now, I'm not going to get a chance, because we only have the hour, to really do a deep dive here into what cognitively is happening in the brain as the result of both the substance use and the anoxia. But if you're working in the addictions field and you took a course perhaps in the impacts of substance use on the brain, you probably saw an illustration like the one on the right-hand side of this slide that looks at the neuroanatomy of reward. And we know that most substances of abuse have their greatest impact on the dopamine tracts, the dopamine being the major neurotransmitter that's involved in the perception of pleasure or reward. And what I would point out here is that we know that the use of opioids has particular effects on those structures. The constant exposure of the brain to these unnatural levels of opioids, such as are produced when you use an opioid substance. You use an opioid and you get this huge shot of dopamine that is many times what would naturally occur with a normal reward like food or sex or an enjoyable activity. And so the brain adapts to that unnatural amount of opioids by causing some opioid receptors to recede. The end effect is that there's a blunting of reward for normal activities. Now, that's probably something that's a familiar concept to most of you folks. Research has shown us that what this process also does is it limits the growth of neurons in the hippocampus, that memory making machinery, that structure that helps to index our memories. And what's happening there is that, you know, our brains are designed to focus on those things that are most enjoyable and most reinforcing. In a perfect world, those would also be the things that are healthiest for us. That's unfortunately not the world we evolved in, but that is the world we are living in now. Is one where the reinforcing effects are sometimes very much in contradiction with what is healthy and good for us. And so we have that narrowing of focus to those things that seem to be most reinforcing. And that results in that kind of tunnel vision that we often see in our clients, where they may know a lot of information about the opioids and how to obtain them. And they're exquisitely sensitive to those memories that act as triggers. And they may have much more difficulty in remembering other types of information because their blunted reward system has made them less sensitive to the need to remember that sort of information. And we know that, you know, the blunting has made some information or some kinds of experiences much more rewarding. And we know that there's damage to the frontal lobes. Now, what do the frontal lobes do? Well, they're responsible for providing some leadership in the brain and doing that sort of top-down regulation of all of those drive states. So our brains are responsible for planning and interpretation of what actually is good for us, sometimes delaying gratification, and definitely regulating emotion. And that top-down regulation of our frontal lobes can be directly impacted by the substance use itself, and then further impaired by the episode of anoxia. Other sources of neurocognitive impairment, you know, if polysubstance use is associated with an increased risk of stroke, again, infectious diseases, and then also the toxicity of other substances, perhaps stimulants, like methamphetamine, which we know has a horrible impact on the white matter, causing its own kind of leukoencephalopathy. Now, why is traumatic brain injury and other kinds of substance uses so closely linked? There's a lot of information that I could present here, but very briefly, intoxication increases the risk for falls and other episodes like aggression and violence that increases the risk of having a brain injury. Each fall or overdose increases the likelihood of neurocognitive impairment. And the nature of brain injuries, we're going to talk about in just a second, and the kind of outcomes you get from brain injury, even if it occurs early in life, may make you more susceptible to substance use and substance use disorders. And we know that there's a strong link between brain injury and mental health, particularly anxiety and depression, but also thought disorders that can sometimes be diagnosed as psychotic disorders, and other changes in behavior that may appear to be or have the same characteristics as, say, personality disorders. All of those things can worsen after an acquired brain injury. And the cognitive and mental health consequences of brain injury often will make it more difficult to engage in and to benefit from the care that you're trying to provide. There's a lot of populations that are highly at risk for acquired brain injury, and these include substance users, as we talked about, people who are in the military, who may be having specific brain injuries related to their service, but also a lot of subconcussive as a result of blast exposures, athletes who may have recognized concussions, but also a lot of subconcussive blows that may result in longer term issues. People with a previous TBI, having one TBI puts you at 2- and 3-fold risk at having future TBIs and or traumatic brain injuries, and being homeless or marginally housed. And I'll highlight this as something that I know is affecting a lot of the folks that are being served in programs designed to address opioid use disorders. There's a lot of attention being paid, particularly over about the past 5 or 10 years, about the strong intersection between homelessness in opioid use disorders. This is one very recent paper that talks about the frequency of acquired brain injury and how often it is occurring, and new injuries are occurring in this population. But there's also a lot of good evidence that as many as half of all brain injuries, as many as half of all people who present to programs for housing have some significant history of acquired brain injury, and the majority of those occurred prior to the episode of homelessness. In this particular study, we see that about 61% or more had a history of traumatic brain injury. What I thought was really most compelling about this was that they have a much higher new annual incidence. So where in any given year, about 1% of the population will have a concussion. It's 20% of people who are homeless or marginally housed. And one of the things that comes out in that research is that opioid dependence and a previous history of traumatic brain injury are very significant risk factors for that. We know that a significant proportion, almost 10%, are opioid related of those new brain injuries. Most of them are related to intoxication, and a lot of them are moderate injuries or severe injuries, about 20%, which we would anticipate would have lasting neurocognitive impairments beyond the immediate blow or concussion. Now, it's a whole other huge area of research is what is the impact of traumatic brain injury on the developing brain? And a big overview, kind of maybe oversimplification, but certainly is true, that early insults, if they occur at the right point in development, can have an outsized effect later on as the brain develops. And this seems to be true, particularly in like 3 to 5 year olds, and then in early adolescence, when there's either a big pruning happening in the brain to make the brain more efficient, or a big explosion of the development of new tracts. So we know that apparently mild injuries in childhood, when we look at longitudinal data following these kids into adulthood, increases their risk for mental health disorders, substance use disorders, legal involvement. They tend to have lower educational attainment, and then also, as we were talking about, homelessness. So, I mean, like if we summarize this, and there's a bit of a bottom line here, it's that if you screen for brain injury in the people that you're serving, it's a marker for complexity. It's going to tell you that they're at much higher risk for mental health issues, complex substance use disorders, and a greater need for perhaps repeated episodes of care. We know that about 75% of people who show up in concurrent disorders programs have a history of significant brain injury, more than one with loss of consciousness, which usually or often means that there is some change in behavior and cognition that's lasting. We know that brain injury is associated with more and more severe psychiatric symptoms. And I think, and this is a finding that has been persistent in as long as I've been practicing, that there's about a 3-fold risk of increased suicide after a brain injury. Mild brain injuries in adolescents also carry that risk for increased risk of suicide. And it's strongly associated with other social determinants of health. So the folks that you're working with who are impoverished, who are having difficulty with housing or socially isolated, all of those things are a perfect storm for increased history of brain injury. So, you know, it's prevalent in the people that you're serving, probably no matter which setting you're serving them in. If you're working with folks who have substance use disorders, it's about a lifetime incidence. Now we're talking about is about 1 in 5 in the general population of concussion. I've had one. Most people. Many people have had it. I think it's the majority of people of us have had some blow that we would describe as a mild traumatic brain injury. That's increased to about, that's certainly much more prevalent, and multiple injuries are much more prevalent. It's about half of people who are seeking substance use disorders, about half of psychiatric inpatients, and it's a whopping 3/4 of people who are seeking services for concurrent disorders. Now, I'm showing you that reward system thing because I want to point out what the relationship is between the machinery that's involved in addictions and substance use disorders. And what you can see on this illustration is that the pattern of brain injuries, traumatic brain injuries, isn't random. Because of the way the brain sits in the skull, the frontal lobes and the supraorbital frontal lobes are really the most vulnerable structures. And when the brain twists or shakes, it's that column in the middle that connects those structures, the striatum, that is also highly at risk for what we call axonal shearing, or the shearing away of connections within the brain. So very predictably, the pattern of brain injury is also affecting all of those structures that are involved in executive functioning and organizing our behavior, and its connections to the emotional machinery that's deeper, and the memory machinery that's deeper in our brains. So there's that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that's at risk for planning and organization and all those intellectual things that we do to keep ourselves organized. And then the supraorbital cortex right above the eyes that is responsible for things that we would describe kind of as personality, like the ability to manage emotions, the ability to recognize social cues and to use social cues. And knowing that those structures are more vulnerable, and knowing that they really do overlap with all of those structures that are related in dopamine distribution and are more vulnerable to the effects of opioid use disorders, you can see how the combined impact really does create a complex and kind of, a perfect storm for complexity. So now, with about probably 10, 15 minutes left to talk, I have to tell you, what are we going to do about this? Right? So what helps? Well, screening for brain injury. And we talk about history of brain injury, but also including overdoses, so that you have an idea of what is this person's likelihood of having neurocognitive impairment. And then the next thing is functionally assessing for that cognitive impairment, that or that difficulty in getting along and doing activities of daily living, making accommodations for that, and then intervention in referral. And it sounds like a really tall order. And in fact, it is a very tall order. But what we've tried to do is to think through strategies that will allow you to, knowing as well you do, the settings that you're working in and the circumstances that are most relevant to the clients that you're serving, how to implement these different kinds of recommendations. So the first recommendation is for routine screening for brain injury and other sources of neurocognitive impairment. And depending on your setting, that screening process will look different. If you're in a medical setting, it may make sense to do a full screen with full history. If you're working in a shelter setting, for example, your screening may be looking for those people who have the outward signs that perhaps they're struggling with their cognition, and then doing a screening, or doing a very simple screening for all comers. And so familiarizing yourself with the different kinds of screening methods, and I'll tell you how you can do that. Learning to recognize behaviors as the result of neurocognitive challenges. Now, in some settings, that may mean actually screening for the neurocognitive impairment very specifically and providing very specific adaptations. For other settings, it may be simply being aware of them and having things that the clinician who is working with the client can do in the immediate presence to help them compensate. Making programs more accommodating. Again, a wide spectrum of possibilities. The most important thing that we can do generally, though, is to view complexity as a rule. We are in love with specialization in North America and also in some European jurisdictions. And I've spoken with folks in like Australia, New Zealand, and they suffer from the same problem, where we really want brain injury specialists and addiction specialists. What that doesn't help us to do is to develop service structures that integrate those areas of knowledge for the folks who are presenting with complexities. I know that in Canada, and I know that talking to my counterparts in the States, it's very often difficult to get resources together for folks, depending on what their financial and insurance situation is, or depending on the jurisdiction in which they live, which means that we all have to take responsibility, whether we're on the brain injury side of things or whether we're on the addiction side of things, to having enough of a hand in either of those sectors to be able to integrate our interventions in a sensible and complex, sensible way that's evidence-based. So let's start out with the most obvious kind of screening. You know, what does cognitive impairment look like? Well, is your client missing appointments? Are they apathetic? Do they lack empathy? Are they having trouble reading social cues and responding in a way that makes sense given their circumstances? Do they come across demanding or rude? Do they seem to have poor insight? Are they having difficulty managing their emotions? And is there a big gap? And I'm borrowing from one of preeminent researchers in this field, John Corrigan, when he talks about the gap between say and do. We know that in addictions, it's a really difficult, a chronic difficulty to live with, and there's often greater intention than there is the ability to follow through with that intention. But in people who are having neurocognitive impairments, that gap is bigger. So they're having even more trouble with following through with what they say that they're going to do. They may seem to lack awareness of the fact that they're not taking notes and they're not really actively compensating for any memory problems they might have. They may have follow through and they may come across as very impulsive. So I'll introduce you very quickly to just a few screening questions that you can use. And I'll show you where you can get access to more information about this. So you know, if you're interviewing about brain injury and a person may not really very fully remember their brain injury, the most important thing to remember is you've got to give them a lot of cues about here's all of the kinds of information I want. So most of these questions have very big stems. They orient the person to the kinds of information that will be relevant to talk about. And so when you're doing these screenings, it's important to stop and think about how the questions are written. And when you do the training, if you do the training, to use all of the cues that are on those forms to help get a fulsome and accurate history. So thinking about any injuries that you've had in your lifetime, were you ever knocked out or did you lose consciousness? And if you're going to be doing this, you're going to be using that full cue that's on the left-hand side of the slide that's kind of saying, you know, maybe you had a car accident, maybe you were hit by a car, etc. And then what was the longest episode that you were knocked out for? And then what was the first episode? And those give a sense for when you learn how to interpret the results of the screening, how likely it is that they're living with some lasting neurocognitive impairment that might be associated with the history that you're getting. And this is a more formal format for the similar questions that might be appropriate if you're doing, say, research, or if you're screening in a more medical setting. It looks like a complex form, but it actually, once you get used to it, if it's a simple history of brain injury, a couple of minutes. If it's a more complex history, maybe up to 3 or 4 minutes to get a full and complete history of a person's lifetime history. That does take a little bit of training, maybe about an hour or so to think about it. And that training is freely available. This is one of the sources of training, brainline.org. I use this because it's an easier URL to remember. And you can just Google brain injury screening or Brainline, and you will get connected to the right resources to learn how to do that kind of screening. Now we know that cognitive impairment in services that treat people for substance use disorders is very prevalent. And a lot of recent research has looked at it. Now, you can see that on the slide, it says 20 to 70%. That's because different screening methods were used. And depending on which population, there might be a higher density of folks with neurocognitive impairment. But again, it's higher in people with more complex presenting difficulties. And it's about, we know very robustly, about 20 to 50% in people with alcohol use disorders. So one of the things that I'll be doing and doing more in-depth training about, but you can get your own training freely online, is how to screen specifically for cognitive impairment that's most likely in folks with substance use disorders. I used to demur on the topic of cognitive screening because most of the cognitive screenings and instruments that are used were actually designed to look at dementia, which has a slightly different profile than people who are coming in with neurocognitive impairment. But I've been very impressed with how our Australian colleagues have developed a specific screening for people for neurocognitive impairment in addiction settings. And then they link that to an intervention and very freely available. There are online modules to train people in addiction settings how to implement this training for their clients. And all the materials are free and readily available. And I have Joe Lund and some of the other, Dr. Barry, some of the folks who have been the researchers who are really spearheading these things. And they're very eager to see these materials get into the hands of programs that are willing to use them. So they're all freely available, and they have been vetted and used in addiction settings in the Australian context. Some of the findings from those programs are that one of the biggest effects that was most impressive is that people really liked the training. They felt like it accommodated their needs, and they were much more likely to complete their programming. And it kind of paid for itself, because if they weren't having about half of the people drop out of inpatient programs before they finish them, or longer term outpatient programs before they finish them, they were spending less on intake and they were having much better outcomes. And it reduces the rate of cognitive impairment. Now, part of that is the recovery that occurs during periods of abstinence, but they were definitely seeing improvements in functioning that clients were appreciating. So I think it's a new area, something that we really should be looking at. And there's some great resources to kind of jump on and have a look at if your program has the capacity to do that. The materials that Steve mentioned earlier are also available freely online. This is a resource that we developed with the Mountain Plains ATTC, the SAMHSA Technology Transfer Centers, and Mid-America. And they together funded this resource. And the resource, and you can see the link to get it, and it's on a page with dozens of other amazing resources in this area. It includes brain basics, a more detailed kind of dive into some of the things that I've talked about a little bit today, screening for brain injury and functional impairments, recognizing and accommodating cognitive impairments, recommendations for service delivery, and different resources that you can use. And I have a few screenshots from it to give you an idea about it. It's not a dense, heavy read. But it provides an overview of what we know about brain injury and the impacts. Information is put in tables so that it's easily accessible, so that somebody who's not a brain injury provider and maybe have no previous understanding of this stuff can have a look and say, okay, so here's what here's what the substances that my clients are doing, what kinds of impacts might I expect to have. What are some of the fine points of implementing screening? We know that in some circumstances, screening for brain injury can be a double-edged sword. If you're, for example, the mom of kids who is in perhaps a domestic abuse situation, having a new diagnosis of brain injury might be frightening, because what if it prejudices me from maintaining contact with my children? And so some understanding about how stigma and trauma-informed care should be applied when we're actually doing the screening for substance use. There's other information that's intended to be very specific and kind of really practical about, if your client's having trouble getting a message, then, and here's an example of that, here are some simple things that you can do if you're sitting with your client to sort of help them to benefit from whatever interaction it is that you're having. We talked a little bit about, and you saw in the video example, that self-awareness and the ability to understand your own needs is often an issue with acquired brain injury. So a portion of the toolbook toolkit is devoted to introducing that concept and how to work with people who may not have full awareness of the kinds of things that they are needing. And then a very big important point is, how do we provide more structure around our clients for in the environment, in the event that their substance use is continuing, they don't have awareness, and they need the environment to be more supportive in order to reduce harms or increase the likelihood that they'll benefit from care. There's a lot of summary information that can serve as reminders to clinicians about some of the information that was provided, and then recommendations for service delivery. And we know that like these recommendations are going to be different depending on what kind of setting you work in and what your job is in that setting. And the one thing that I'll point out to here is that we're using evidence-based interventions or recommendations, and tending to skew towards those that are freely and readily available in terms of training for frontline clinicians. There's a little bit of a very vanilla, kind of very general care planning thing, and the intention there is to introduce how care planning, considering neurocognitive impairment, may be folded into care plans that are already being used in a given setting. Another thing that we've worked on, and these are the materials that we use in our specialized substance use and brain injury program that we've made freely available with the help of the National Association of State Brain Injury Administrators. And it's a client workbook, and it's designed to illustrate how you can develop a program that accommodates neurocognitive impairment. It's not designed to say this is the best way to treat people, but more as an illustration of the kinds of memory devices that may be helpful in getting some of the typical messages that occur in treatment programs across. We find personally that having that physical book present in a person's home, because a lot of our programming is virtual, is, if it's sitting there, it's on the table, it's inviting, that they may actually page through it, and it may remind them of some of the key messages that occurred in the sessions. It's an MI adapted approach. It's an update from a previous version that was less MI consistent. We use inclusive language. We've had it vetted through folks for our Indigenous populations. And up in Canada, although I understand that there's a lot of cultural similarities, and it's intended to be warm and inviting and informative for the clients. There's brief readings to encourage discussion and reflection. There's also, each one has goals, a little bit of information, tips and check-ins. So a person could, using the content of their own program, use a similar format to make their programming more sort of accessible to folks. And finally, if you're interested in getting involved, there is a link. I can put this in the chat if people are interested to sign up for a listserv. Our listserv is still getting started. Sometimes we wind up with too many posts, and I'm trying to do it in a journaled fashion, so you only get one a week. But it's a place where you could perhaps pose questions, find other providers, and we're hoping to link in some jurisdictions ABI providers with addictions providers so that you can do some cross training, figure out ways of promoting referrals, and getting more information about entitlements and that sort of good practical information that'll help you to move forward with your clients.
Dr. Lemsky, I'm so sorry to butt in. This is fantastic. We do have 5 minutes, and we do have some Q&A. I know that you have a couple more slides to get through, but I just wanted to cue you. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I think your timing is great. I was going to just sort of end my formal responses and kind of leave up there for you to look at some, you could review the materials, join the listserv. Did you want to tell me what some of the questions were? Or should I be looking in the Q&A? I see there's 8 there. Here we go. A common question I am asked is, can the effects of hypoxia be reversed? There isn't, unfortunately, a treatment to reverse them. Many, if in an uncomplicated circumstance, you might find that there might be cognitive impairments that tend to resolve over time because of the brain's natural ability to heal itself. But what we've talked about here is it's typically not a one-off, and it's typically not the only thing that's happening. In a person who's had an opioid overdose, they've also had a brain that's exposed to the toxic effects of opioids. To my knowledge, there's no medical treatments for that. It's more doing things that generally promote brain health, and that is a part of the materials, helping people to sleep better, eat better, use the right compensation strategies to improve their overall state. And then they may find that the functional impairments that are associated with hypoxia will be improved. But unfortunately, Mother Nature does its job when it has a good, when it's given an even playing field. And the best advice to clients is whatever is good for your heart is good for your brain. Use heart healthy diet, exercise, and staying away from substances. And that's the most likely way to maximize the recovery that you're going to see. Why is there euphoria? Because the frontal lobes are starved of the part of your brain. This is my understanding of it. I'm sorry, I should be clear about the question. The question is, can you comment on why there is euphoria? Well, the part of our brain that makes us self-aware is not working as well as it might. That's, it's the very end of our blood distribution. It may be the first thing to get starved out when these things are starting to happen. So your brain's natural alarm system has been shut off, and that results in a feeling of well-being because you're no longer perceiving potential threats. The next question by Judith is, I witnessed many of these symptoms in my elder clients who are chain smokers, hypoxia, and sometimes elders who chain smoke and likely have CPOD may be having, particularly while they're smoking, maybe having episodes of hypoxia. Are these brain injury risks and effects unique to opioids? Nope. We know that however anoxia occurs, and we know that sometimes in domestic abuse situations where there's choking or near choking repeatedly, or some practices where an asphyxia is used for pleasure, that these effects can also occur. But they're typically most studied with opioids. And again, like I was saying before, it's always confounded with the toxic effects of the opioids themselves. And any link between brain injury and antisocial personalities. And this is probably the last one we can get to. Working in the prison system, I review numerous persons who had a history of assault and victims at young ages. Absolutely. And there's a robust literature that talks about the high impact of brain injury in our legal systems. And what this has to do with is if the supraorbital cortex is affected and you can't read social cues, and we find this a lot with the folks in our prison system, many people will default to assuming that people are angry. And I can put, in the UK, there's a researcher who has done a lot of work in youth in the system. In Canada, there's a couple of researchers. So we can post some resources about brain injury in the correctional system. But yes, there is a very strong link and a growing literature to talk about, in fact, interventions that might be helpful, including making people aware of the trouble that they're having and reading social cues and providing social skills training. That was speed talking, wasn't it?
That was fantastic.
Oh, it was coherent.
That was fantastic. Again, these recordings, this presentation is recorded, so folks can see this afterwards, and the questions that we weren't able to get to, we will certainly post those answers. Thank you, Dr. Lemsky and Steve for presenting in this month's webinar, and we will see you all hopefully in person next month in Portland. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Are we off?
We are still live.
We are still live. I'm just letting people, in case anyone wants to go through and look at anything in the chat or anything. I haven't closed it yet. I will just shortly though.
All right.
Yeah, this was a great presentation, and I wish we had more than an hour, but that's what we were slotted for, and just to be respectful of everyone's time. But once again, thank you so much.
Yes.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure.
Scott and I
There
were
are
talking about it, that we need to probably create some full day webinar or in-person class on this topic and probably offer it again. We already had that conversation, so we'll be following up.
and I have some slides with resources, and so I'm going to pull out those slides.
Okay.
And they will be posted. Can they be posted with the webinar?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that any of the, that's the best thing about it are the resources. So you can kind of have a look at those.
Yeah. Resources are always appreciated and very much needed. All right.
All right, great job. Take care, everyone.
All right. Take care. Enjoy your weekend. I'm going to end.
Take care.